Hey guys, this is Rich Klein from the Diamond Law Group. Just want to thank you for your time today. We're going to be discussing closing costs. I know it's everyone's favorite topic of conversation. Closing costs are pretty easy to calculate. It's a simple formula. Primarily, it has to do with how much are your taxes, how much is your interest rate, what is your purchase price, what is your loan amount. Then you factor in what day of the month you close and what month of the year. And based upon those factors, you can pretty much gauge what your closing costs are going to be. We're going to start by discussing taxes. For the buyer, if there's going to be a surprise fee, it has to do with taxes. And I'll discuss a little bit later on as to why that is. But for now, we're going to go over the dates that the taxes are due. In Nassau County, there is the town tax. That tax has two halves. The first half is due January 1st and runs through the midway point of the year. And then the second half is due July 1st. There is a grace period, which I'll show you on an actual tax search in a minute. The school tax is a little bit different than the town tax. The school tax, for whatever reason, they consider the first half to start July 1st through the end of the year. That is due October 10th. There's also a grace period, which I'll show you in a minute. However, when you pay in October, that actually covers the tax period from July 1st all the way through July 31st. Then the second half of the school tax is actually due April 1st, which is the first half of the calendar year. And when you pay it in April, that is due January 1st. It covers January 1st through June 30th. In Suffolk County, the first half starts December 1st for whatever reason. Again, there's no rhyme or reason why it's not matched up with the calendar year. And that runs through May 31st. That is due 12/1. There is a grace period. And then the second half school tax is due June 1st. And there is no grace period for the second half June tax. When you look at an actual tax search, this is what it looks like. This property is in Suffolk County, okay, Suffolk County. And it shows what the actual tax is without any exemptions. Then it shows what type of exemptions the homeowner has. That's the basic star exemption right here. And you have what the actual tax that is due after the exemption right here. When you divide that in two, this is the two halves. As I mentioned before, in Suffolk County, it is due December 1st. However, there is a grace period through January 10th. The second half starts to run June 1st, and that is due without penalty by May 31st. These are how the taxes work. At closing, the borrower, the buyer, will pay the seller for any taxes that they have prepaid. And I'll elaborate on that as we go through the actual closing costs. They will actually, if they have an escrow loan, pay the bank at least 2 to 3 months of escrow to start their account. They also will pay any taxes that are due within 60 days. So from our example right here, if our if our purchaser was buying in the month of May, their first mortgage payment would be in the future, which we'll discuss as well. If you close in May, it'll be due in July, and I'll explain why later. If you close in May, though, this tax is due by May 31st. So the title company would be the third party that the borrower pays taxes to. So the surprise fee would be anything that they owe to the seller, because that's not something that's commonly disclosed on loan estimates. So you need to factor in anything that you may owe to the seller simply by when you're closing and when the end of the tax period would be. So for this example, if we closed in May, you would owe the seller any taxes that they owed in May. You would owe the bank 2 or 3 months of taxes for escrow, and then you would owe the title company another 6 months of taxes right here. All in all, it's 6 months to the lender, 2 months to your bank, that's up to 8, and then 1 month for your seller. So that's 9 months of taxes. It gets kind of tricky for your buyers to understand, so it helps to go over the actual numbers, which I'll show you guys in a second. Keep in mind, there's also villages and cities within Long Island. There's 2 cities, Long Beach and Glen Cove, and they have totally different tax periods and payment dates. New York City goes by quarters, the first of which is July 1st. There's other things to take into consideration when we're adjusting. We're going to look at sellers' closing costs now. So here's a closing statement for a seller. Simply put, we have the purchase price, okay, what they're selling the property for. We have what the buyer already put down on contract. So the buyer does not owe that to the seller at the time of closing because they already paid it as part of their closing costs, as part of their down payment, rather, I apologize, part of their down payment. So this is what we're calculating on page 1 is what the seller is due at closing. They're due the property condition disclosure credit because most sellers don't provide the actual disclosure. They just give the credit, which is the penalty per New York state law. That is the seller's option. For our example here, this closing date was October 28th. The seller is due back taxes for the next 33 days until the end of the tax period, that being November 30th. And this is how much it is per day. This is how much the seller is getting as a tax credit right here. When you add up all of this, this is what the seller is due. This is what the buyer is due when you subtract the 2. This is what the seller is due at closing. If there was an oil adjustment, that would be on here as well, though most times that's presented at closing. It can be paid via personal check. When we scroll down, again, this is the number that the seller is due. It's not what they're walking away at closing, however, because they need to pay off some other items. So this is the number we're going to remember, right? Here's the number from page 3. This is the balance that is due to the seller. We're then going to pay off all of their closing costs to the tune of $31,310. And you say, wow, that's a lot of money. What does that include? Well, let me show you. First thing is that here's the same number on their closing costs. Includes the title invoice. You say, well, why is the seller paying a title invoice? Well, we're going to scroll down to the title invoice here. This is the title invoice. And you see that the seller's column here has to pay a transfer tax. The transfer tax in New York State is calculated as $2 per every 500 of the purchase price. This is the purchase price here, as we said before. The easiest way to calculate that is to take the purchase price and divide by 250. That's for New York State, okay? There's additional taxes to the seller for New York City as well, if they have to pay a transfer tax. Moving back up to our closing costs here, they then have to pay 2 agents their commission. They then have to pay, most importantly, our attorney fee right here, our overnight fee, and then there's a title closer fee, which is for the title closer to pay off the loan. All right, so this is the total of the closing costs. As you can see here, most of this is pretty statutory. There's not much wiggle room. The transfer tax is what it is. The commissions are usually 4, 5, 6%. This is our fee, and then the title closer fee. Total closing costs. You're going to then subtract that from what the buyer owes the seller. The seller's not writing checks at closing. They're just going to make that payable from the money that the buyer is borrowing from their loan. We're then going to pay off their mortgage. This borrower's mortgage payoff was this sum right here. That includes interest from the last payment that the seller made. So for instance, if you paid your mortgage July 1st, that was for June's interest. It's very common that sellers will come to closing and say, this payoff is too high. That's not what I saw online. That's because you need to add interest. If you last paid July 1st, if we're closing, let's say July 23rd, you need to add all of that interest plus a couple of days in order for the title closer to overnight the payoff check to the bank, and then a couple of days for the bank to process it. It also, the payoff may include a satisfaction fee, and that's necessary for the county to record the satisfaction of record. Okay, next, if the closing costs, when you subtract out the mortgage and the closing costs from the balance that is due from the seller, this is the total amount of money that the seller is due from the buyer and their lender at closing. This is what the two checks you must receive from the buyer and their bank at closing. If you remember, I have this amount of money in escrow for the down payment. So this is the third check that the seller would receive. They traditionally receive 3 checks, one from the seller's attorney from the money held from the buyer's down payment in escrow, and the buyer's bank, which is the larger check traditionally, from the money that the borrower is taking out from their bank, and then one from the borrower themselves if they brought the check in that way. The 3 checks will total this amount right here. It's always good to add it up in front of your client in order to make sure that they see the checks, because otherwise, at the end of the closing, the checks just get thrown at the seller rather, and they want to know that everything adds up. It's the worst thing that you could possibly do is see your client, the seller, take out a calculator and add up everything themselves, which they certainly have the right to do, but they shouldn't be the one doing so initially. The seller, however, is not giving the keys over, so they have to hold back some money in escrow per the contract. This is the total sale proceeds that the seller is receiving at closing. If this was a condominium sale, the seller might have some additional fees. If it was a co-op, it would certainly be different. There wouldn't be title fees. There would be management company fees. And that's how sellers' closing costs work, all right? Moving on to the buyers, it's a little bit more complicated. This is the same client who is selling their home. If you look back over here, this is the total profit that the seller had to apply towards their purchase in the same day. So we closed this client's sale at, let's say, 10 o'clock in the morning, and then we closed their purchase later on that afternoon. This 589 number is how much we had payable at the time of our sale to our purchase. We don't have the checks payable to the client and then deposit them and then have to wait for them to clear, because you'd never be able to close a sale and a purchase simultaneously in order to effectuate the seller then removing their belongings into the house that they're purchasing. So we had this 589 payable to our seller on our purchase. So here's the purchase. This client then bought for $750,000. Keep in mind, now this is a purchaser's closing statement. So now we're on the right-hand side of the transaction. We then paid $75,000 at the time of the contract. We then receive a $500 credit for the property condition disclosure, which is a wash from the sale. Our client again purchased in Suffolk County and received the same exact type of credit for the taxes that they had to actually pay out to the seller rather from the 25th through the 30th. This is how much it is per day. So this is what they paid to their seller. The total seller costs, the total buyer costs. This is what our purchaser owed to our seller at the time of their purchase, okay? Let's see how they're gonna pay this off. Scrolling down, 675. Again, this is the same exact amount that they owe to the seller. They then need to add closing costs, right? They're not taking out of what they're receiving. They have to come up with the money. This is the total closing costs that they have to pay on their purchase right here. And you say, well, what does that include? Let's see. Here's the same number. First, they have their title invoice. As you can see, it's substantially more. And you say, well, why? Good question. Let me show you. Here's their title invoice, okay? They have to pay a title insurance policy that says they own the property free and clear of all liens and judgments. They then have to pay the bank a reduced policy for their insurance as well. These are endorsements that are required by the lender. Similar to car insurance, how they have certain requirements, these are endorsements that are required for this type of insurance policy. This is the mortgage tax. This is the amount of money that is due to New York State for the right to borrow this sum of money right here. You have to pay 0.8 of 1% less $30. That is the statutory amount for New York State. If you are borrowing in New York City, you have to pay more. These are recording fees. Again, these are not profit for the title company. This is direct going to the municipality. And then these are the taxes that are due for the title company. As I mentioned at the very beginning, anything that is due within 60 days has to be collected from the title company. The problem is this tax is an estimated tax. We're closing again in October. The tax is due in December, but the actual invoice doesn't even come out until December 1st, even though there's a grace period thereafter. So this title company had to collect 20% above last year's taxes, which will be refunded to them after the title company pays the actual tax. Okay. So we have an escrow service fee and other searches that are required in order for the transaction to go through. Recording fee per document, overnights. This first one here was to pay the taxes they need to overnight. These are for the municipal searches, bankruptcy searches, $25 per name, Patriot searches, more municipal fees. The title content to make sure that the title report gets updated. And here is the sales tax, of course. There's another tax. This is the total title invoice right here. All right. So scrolling back up, here's the same title invoice. We have a new survey. Usually this is the approximate amount, maybe a little bit less. We then go on to bank fees. Let me show you what the bank fees are. This is the total, which include the following. For this loan amount, we have a credit report. There's an appraisal fee, prepaid interest. This is interest from the date of closing through the end of the month. So we closed on the 25th. So this is 6 days worth of interest. Because we closed in October, October's interest is collected at closing. November goes by and November's interest is collected retroactively December 1st. If you recall from the seller's payoff, I said that you needed to add interest. This is the exact reason why. It works the exact opposite of rent. When you rent for the month of November, your landlord traditionally would expect you to collect the or pay the rent November 1st before you could stay there. That works the exact opposite for mortgages. It's more like a hotel when you pay at the end after you've stayed there. They have this, they call them bank fees. It must be other miscellaneous fees that they paid. Escrows to start their account. If you recall before, I said there were 3 types of taxes. This is the other one. This is a couple of months to start their escrow account. Just to refresh, because this is the most tricky part about closing costs, I said you have to pay taxes to 3 people. Here's the escrows right here. That's usually disclosed correctly. Moving back up, we have the second tax here to the seller for another month. And then if you scroll down to the title invoice, we have another 6 months right here. So this 6 plus the other 2 to the bank plus another 1 to the seller is 9 months worth of taxes. And if your borrower is of the impression it's only gonna be 2 or 3, they're gonna be sorely mistaken and upset. This client paid points to either extend or buy down their rate, and the total closing costs, the way you calculate that is you take the loan amount less what they refer to as the net proceeds right here, and that will equal the bank fees right here. The bank does not send the bank attorney the full loan amount. They net fund, in other words, they keep whatever this amount is because that's due to them. And they send the balance in a wire to the bank attorney. Again, most importantly, our fee here to represent the buyer, our overnight fee, and then the title fee on the purchase. Total closing costs for the purchase are right here. We're then going to add that to what the seller owes. This is what they owe everyone to purchase this home. They then borrowed $250, so we're going to take out that from what the borrower is due to the seller, equals this sum right here. However, if you recall on the other page, it said that we had $589, right? Let's go back to our sale. We had $589, $262.29 to apply to our purchase. That means that after our client purchased, they received back a refund of $141,508.39. So the amount of money that they borrowed plus what they profited from their sale, after you apply that to the purchase, including the down payment, they receive this money back on their after their purchase. There are other fees that are due depending on the location of where you close, as well as the purchase price. If you purchase on the East End, in the Hamptons, in the North Fork, you have to pay what's known as a Peconic Bay tax. If you close in Westchester or New York City, there's additional fees. If you purchase over $1 million, that is deemed to be a mansion, and you have to pay a mansion tax. That is 1% of the purchase price. Unfortunately, when you calculate the actual closing costs, your clients may be even more confused because they've reviewed something known as a closing disclosure, which needs to be acknowledged by the borrower 72 business hours prior to. So in other words, 3 days before we close. If we close on Monday, the earliest closing date could be Thursday. They need to review that, and they presume it's accurate, but it's not. It doesn't have all of the fees on it usually. The 72-hour time frame includes Saturdays, does not include Sundays. It also does not include federal holidays. The other confusing aspect of either a loan estimate or a closing disclosure as reviewed by your borrower is it says attorney fee on there. And they say, oh, wow, they have, I guess, just an average of attorney's fees. Unfortunately, that's not correct. If you are taking out a loan, you actually have to pay a bank attorney a separate attorney fee. So you pay two attorney's fees, one of which is to your attorney as the borrower, and one of which is to the bank attorney as a separate fee. If there was a condo, there might be additional fees, capital contribution, homeowner association dues, the next month's payments, common charges. If this was a co-op, it would be totally different. There would be no title insurance, and you would have different fees associated with that as well. All right, so it's just due to the management company. It's important when you go over the closing costs with your clients to make sure that they understand all of this in advance. The bank, through their best due diligence, only has a certain statutory obligation, and through their loan estimate compared to at the beginning of the application compared to at closing, there's a certain variance that the closing fees could be off. That's known as a curative. And if the closing costs are off by a certain percentage, the bank actually has to pay for it. But the problem is that only applies to certain types of fees. They refer to those as the APR fees, things that having to do with the bank or certain statutory title fees like mortgage tax and things of that nature. It's very misleading to think that all closing costs are disclosed to your bank. Unfortunately, they're not. There's certain other types of transactions, like let's say new construction, where you would have to pay additional fees per the original contract. Usually you would have to pay the transfer tax on a new construction transaction as well. If you're purchasing from an REO, a foreclosure, usually you'd have to pay the transfer tax on that as well. So these are all considerations that you really need to take into consideration when you're representing your client in order to make sure they understand everything up front, because the entire transaction could go perfectly fine, only to have at closing, the closing costs be totally out of whack, and your borrower, through no fault of their own, is relying upon you either as the attorney or another professional to go over this with them, and they're going to be sorely upset, and you're going to be relying upon your homeowner and your purchaser to refer you, and then they're going to blame you that the closing costs were totally off. So you really need to retain somebody who represents purchasers and sellers, so that way they can fine-tune the nuances ahead of time. It doesn't change the fact that the borrower or the seller need to pay these costs. They always do. However, knowing in advance and realizing you have to pay and versus finding out it's a surprise anyway, they're going to feel like something was wrong, and they potentially look to get out of it, that there's another mistake made, that you're not being accurate. So really, you need to know what you're doing in advance. So I hope you guys appreciate this. I realize it's somewhat complex, but that's why we get paid the big bucks, to make sure that your clients understand all of this in advance, and the closing can go as seamless as possible. All right, guys. So again, we'll send you all of the information to submit your continuing education requests to us. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Take care.